Modern corporate social interaction is not a collaborative human environment. It is a synchronized survival simulation. Every interaction is driven by severe autonomic nervous system dysregulation. You think you are building professional connections. You are actually executing a sustained high-grade stress response. The pursuit of social validation does not create safety or warmth. It forces your biology into a continuous fight-or-flight state. Your resting heart rate elevates merely to meet unwritten behavioral quotas. Your breathing becomes shallow to manage constant perceived threats from your peers. This continuous performance systematically erodes your baseline psychological structure. Your nervous system completely forgets how to exist without an audience. Watch closely how they react in a standard office lobby. A receptionist sits behind a polished reception counter. He maintains a maximum full-teeth exposure, smile for 45 consecutive minutes. His lips are pulled unnaturally taut across his upper gums. He executes a rigid, predetermined sequence of travel-related questions. His vocal pitch is artificially elevated to simulate harmlessness, yet his ocular muscles remain completely static. There is zero microcontraction around his eyes. It is a dead, mechanical, defensive stare. The visitors finally turn and walk away. They pass through the heavy glass conference room doors. They break his direct line of sight. Notice what happens to his physical form in that exact millisecond. The forced tension in his zygomatic major muscles instantly releases. The engineered smile violently collapses. There is a visible, sudden drooping of his entire lower facial structure. His jaw physically slacks. His cervical spine immediately compresses. The biological puppet strings are instantly severed. But here is the brutal physical reality. Why does the basic human desire to be liked manifest as sheer physical rigidity? Why does it demand flawless, synchronized mimicry? Why does it trigger instantaneous, crippling physiological exhaustion the absolute second the audience disappears? Group alignment and laughter in hierarchical environments are driven entirely by threat avoidance. It is never about genuine humor. It is never about intellectual agreement. The actual fatal mechanism is hyperactivation of the amygdala. This pairs directly with forced suppression by the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. An individual encounters an ambiguous social cue from a superior. It is usually a structurally incoherent joke. The brain instantly categorizes this moment of interaction. It registers a lack of immediate alignment as a direct physical threat. It threatens your social standing. It threatens your resource access. This instantly triggers a mild sympathetic nervous system response. Your heart rate sharply elevates. Your nervous system physically prepares for immediate defense. To neutralize this perceived threat, the brain initiates a hijacking protocol. The prefrontal cortex artificially overrides the motor cortex. It forces the execution of a non-Duchenne laugh. This is a purely fabricated, mechanical vocalization. It entirely lacks the involuntary contraction of the orbicularis oculi muscles around your eyes. The vocal cords vibrate, but the upper face remains completely dead. The brain strictly prioritizes immediate camouflage over authentic emotional expression. Watch closely how they react in a standard executive meeting. 5 individuals sit evenly spaced around an oval table. They exhibit a uniform 45-degree cervical spine flexion toward the center. There are 0 spontaneous hand gestures. The superior initiates a vocalization intended as humor. Instantly, all 5 individuals erupt into high-decibel, rhythmic exhalations. The pitch is coordinated and identical. Exactly 3.2 seconds later, the vocalizations cease in absolute unison. The silence is sudden and complete. The individuals immediately reseat their facial musculature. They snap back to a tense, static baseline. They resume methodical, flattened speech patterns. Every word is optimized to reflect the emerging consensus. No one presents intellectual dominance. No one breaks the algorithmic alignment. The physical toll of this performance is immediate. It creates chronic neuromuscular tension. The cervical and facial regions remain locked in a rigid, defensive state. You are constantly and consciously suppressing authentic neurological responses. This leads directly to immediate, crushing cognitive fatigue. It manifests as dull, throbbing tension headaches directly behind the orbital bone. And it gets worse. This physiological manipulation extends far beyond the confines of the conference room. It does not stop when you leave the building. It actively corrupts the biological mechanisms of human leisure. It fundamentally destroys your capacity for actual intimacy. Voluntary social gatherings among colleagues operate strictly on self-preservation protocols. They demand the complete and absolute suppression of the authentic self. This is the only physical way to maintain optimal hierarchical positioning. The actual fatal mechanism occurs during unstructured social time. You sit down for a supposed leisure dinner with your peers. Your brain immediately begins to continuously calculate the consensus average of the group's opinions. This continuous environmental monitoring requires a massive working memory load. Your cognitive resources are entirely diverted to threat assessment and verbal alignment. This forces the immediate biological suppression of your default mode network. The default mode network is the specific neural circuitry responsible for authentic self-referential thought. It is the physical engine of genuine identity construction. By constantly calculating what is safe to say, you mechanically power down the exact brain region that makes you who you are. Normal human social interactions are biologically designed to trigger oxytocin release. This hormone promotes physical bonding and neurological safety. But here is the brutal physical reality. Your brain requires a continuous internal drip of cortisol to monitor your hierarchical status. This stress hormone is required to actively filter and censor your personal anecdotes in real time. The constant, elevated presence of cortisol actively blocks your oxytocin receptors. Your brain becomes chemically incapable of processing warmth or human connection. The interaction remains entirely and violently transactional. Watch closely how they react in a standard corporate dinner setting. A group of 8 individuals mechanically chew their food. They are actively scanning and modifying their personal statements before vocalizing them. Individual A listens to a discussion regarding a current event. He immediately suppresses a forming, opposing viewpoint. He intentionally mirrors the exact phrasing and specific syntax of individual B. A server approaches the perimeter of the table. She instantly and artificially elevates her vocal pitch by a half octave. She widens her palpebral fissures to expose the maximum amount of her sclera. She physically simulates extreme, unwarranted enthusiasm. She is executing a rigid behavioral script. It is designed strictly to extract maximum financial currency from a high-status group. The result is profound psychological isolation. It occurs despite the extreme close physical proximity of the group. Your brain is expending massive caloric energy to project an optimized, non-threatening persona. It literally lacks the metabolic bandwidth to process a genuine connection. No individual in that physical space is actually interacting with another human being. They are exclusively interacting with projected survival algorithms. They are conversing with empty biological shells. Once the social performance finally concludes, once the physical external audience is completely removed, your central nervous system is left alone to process a massive biological debt. It must pay for this continuous, brutal adaptation. The leisure time following manufactured social interactions is completely false. It is not actual physiological recovery. It is a state of profound neuro-exhaustion. It is a biological holding pattern driven by an anticipatory allostatic load. The actual fatal mechanism is parasympathetic failure. You have endured hours of forced sympathetic nervous system activation. You successfully maintained the optimized winner persona. The sudden physical cessation of external social stimuli triggers a sharp drop in adrenaline. Your body physically attempts to initiate a rest cycle, but your cortisol levels remain chronically and dangerously elevated. This is driven entirely by anticipatory anxiety. Your brain is already calculating the required social performance for the following day. Your prefrontal cortex is severely depleted of metabolic energy. To artificially self-soothe this damaged neural network, you engage in passive behavior. You initiate low-effort, repetitive, dopaminergic consumption. This specific passive state actively blocks the brain from entering restorative, neuroplastic phases. Your neural pathways cannot execute necessary structural repairs. Your central nervous system remains permanently locked in a low-grade silent stress response. Watch closely how they react in their private living space. An individual crosses the threshold of their apartment. They immediately collapse their cervical and lumbar spine. They sink into a completely slouched, biologically unsupported position on a sofa. Their gaze fixes rigidly on a light-emitting diode screen. The screen displays rapidly shifting, fragmented digital media. Their facial musculature goes entirely slack. Their jaw drops and their mouth hangs slightly parted. Their heart rate variability remains dangerously low. Their respiration is incredibly shallow and restricted in the upper chest. Their neural pathways involuntarily loop through the exact social calculations of the previous 10 hours. They mechanically review every potential verbal misstep. They are unconsciously anticipating the required physiological adjustments for the next 24-hour cycle. And it gets worse. Physical atrophy of the authentic self. You reduce your entire biological existence to a daily performance loop. You execute this mechanical routine solely for external validation. You actively trade your distinct internal reality for basic social preservation. You continue this exact transaction until the actual self completely ceases to exist. You become entirely hollow outside of the performance. This creates a terrifying biological paradox. If the preservation of the self requires the systematic destruction of your individuality, what exact entity are you actually keeping alive? The ultimate reality is absolute. The successful winner you are desperately striving to be does not actually exist. It is a completely hollow biological construct. Exhausting effort to be liked does not foster human connection. It is merely an ancient evolutionary defense mechanism. It is operating in massive overdrive within an artificial corporate environment. You believe you are preserving your professional livelihood. You are not preserving yourself at all. You are blindly executing a continuous neurological script. This script serves only one fatal function. It ensures your true identity remains entirely unknown to your peers, and eventually it remains completely unknown to you. Here is the exact physical protocol to break this cycle. You must immediately cease the automatic execution of non-Duchenne social responses. Do not smile unless your ocular muscles contract involuntarily. In your next hierarchical interaction, wait for an objectively unfunny statement from a superior. When it is spoken, forcefully maintain a neutral facial baseline. Do not adjust your vocal pitch. Do not exhale rhythmically. Simply sit still and observe the immediate physical discomfort in the room. Watch their nervous systems desperately try to process your lack of alignment. You must consciously document every single instance where you suppress your default mode network. Track the exact moments you swallow your own thoughts to mirror a consensus opinion. You must intentionally introduce sharp, mechanical friction into your automated social algorithms. This is the only biological method remaining to locate the physical boundaries of your actual identity. You have to force the social system to crash to see what is left behind. If you are ready to stop functioning as an automated biological response, if you refuse to remain optimized solely for corporate survival, subscribe to this channel.